And we are back on the Zero Hour. I am Richard RJ Eskow. And when I started writing about Wall Street issues about 5 or 6 years ago, I guess I should say, when I started writing publicly about them, there was one name, one byline I kept seeing over and over, and that byline was Janet Tavakoli. And I kept thinking, this person understands what's going on. This person really gets it. And she does. Janet Tavakoli is the president of Tavakoli Structured Finance, a derivatives risk consulting firm for financial institutions. She comes out of Wall Street herself. She has traveled the world. She has written on a number of subjects. And her new book is entitled Decisions, Life and Death on Wall Street. Janet, thanks so much for joining us.
Hi, Richard. It's great to be here.
Well, we are, as I say, delighted to have you. And listen, you've always been a really smart, sound writer on financial issues. I always appreciate what you have to say. I was especially interested in this book, Decisions, Life and Death on Wall Street, which really talks about the people, the human stories, as well as the financial issues, because it's always struck me that what people don't recognize about Wall Street or the financial world in general and don't pay enough attention to is the fact that it's not just about money. It is a culture. It's a system. It's a social system, self-reinforcing. And if it reinforces destructive behavior, then there will be more destructive financial behavior and so on. So what was your thinking in writing this book? Did you want to give insights on the culture, because you certainly do, or what was your motivation?
Well, Richard, it's interesting. You, of all people, should ask that because, yes, the answer to your question is yes, I did want to give more insight into the culture because you and I and people like Nomi Prinz and David Stockman and others who have a great deal of financial expertise and experience in the business have been writing a lot of fact-based articles that, for the average person, are very hard to digest. And we've made these points over and over and over, and we're missing a large swath of the audience who is craving information about what happened and what is continuing to happen and why they are being told one story by the media, but their eyes tell them a very different story.
Yeah, and, that's a great way to put it, Janet, because I think what we're really seeing is for the average person, when it comes to Wall Street or finance or the economy in general, it's almost a kind of cognitive dissonance where people in positions of authority, whether in the media or in politics, are by and large saying, well, things are okay. We have people with expertise in these areas. There's no need to worry, but their senses are telling them to be on alert, to be worried, and they don't know what to be worried about or why. Do you get what I'm driving at?
I do get what you're driving at, and you've made that point very well, that the media, the financial media, has let people down and given them a false narrative. You wrote something quite some time ago on the Huffington Post about Andrew Ross Sorkin, who appears on CNBC and writes for the New York Times, and who has praised Jamie Dimon to the skies, calling him a great manager. And yet, the evidence is completely contrary to that, where he has failed to live up to his responsibilities even after the global financial crisis. And, just to give a couple of examples that call his competence into question, one was the Bear Stearns merger. Originally, the bank, J.P. Morgan, was bidding only $1 per share. But because they screwed up the paperwork, they ended up paying $10 a share. That's a big difference. And you think that they would have looked over the clauses very carefully, but it was just an extremely avoidable error. And
right,
and
as I recall, before you've warmed my heart, Janet, by bringing up Jamie Dimon, because I really think Jamie Dimon, the CEO of J.P. Morgan Chase, because I really think he is. I write about him a lot, as you know, or may know, but because I think he represents so much about what's wrong with our reporting culture of finance and of Wall Street culture itself. I mean, the guy's lying. I've got nothing against him personally, and that's the other thing I want to get your thoughts on. I don't. People say, well, you must hate bankers or whatever. You must be embittered. You must be like, the fallen angel of No, not at all. I just know them. And I know that given the chance to behave the way Jamie Dimon has behaved, which is to mismanage your own organization, to at best be incapable of rooting out massive and repeated incidents of fraud, and to be lionized and well paid for it, who wouldn't roll with that if it was working for it?
Well, I agree with you with that. There are people, though, who would actually roll up their sleeves and get the job done. And he chose not to do that, which is very curious. One of the things you bring forward is how the press lionizes them. The press has created these golden calves, as if these are the people that we should be admiring. And yet there are many people in your own life, I'm sure, who deserve your admiration much more than the people of the press are telling you should admire. And in Dimon's case, they are not only telling you should admire him, but that he exudes competence. And exactly the opposite is true. I met with Dimon. It was a very telling meeting for me, and it was an alarming meeting for me because I went to Dimon to talk to him about an extreme problem in the global financial system. Now, I have a lot of expertise in credit derivatives and collateralized debt obligations. When I call somebody and say, I need to speak with you, people generally take that meeting. And I had done this once before with Dimon in August of 2007. I don't call these meetings lightly. Obviously, there's something heavy on my mind, and people know that. So in August of 2007, I met with Dimon about AIG. That was a year before the AIG implosion. Now, in March of 2009, I was going to Dimon about a different matter, which I'll explain in a second, but we never actually got to talk about the topic of the meeting that I wanted to talk about. And the reason was Jamie Dimon looked like he was on the verge of a nervous breakdown. And, to see a man crumbling before your eyes is astonishing, at least for me. First of all, I'm an outsider to the bank. He took the meeting one-on-one, and the man was practically crying on my shoulder. Metaphorically, he wasn't really crying on my shoulder, but what he was doing is saying, as if to persuade himself, I've been through a recession before, Janet. You don't remember the recession of the 1970s, but I remember it. And I said, Jamie, I'm 3 years older than you are. I remember it very well. It sounded as if he were repeating PR talking points. And he wasn't processing or hearing what I was saying. He said it again in the conversation later on. Then he said it again. And I realized that he was in no state of mind to take in what I was saying. If you'll remember what was happening in March of 2009, the stock market had hit bottom, and it rebounded the following month because we changed accounting rules which allowed banks to disguise their losses more thoroughly. And also in March, Congress had passed a bill through the House. It was going on its way to the Senate that was going to put a 90% tax on bankers' bonuses. And the day I met with Dimon was the day the bill left the House. And he was terrified that the Senate might approve the bill because he would lose his control of the people under him who paid dignity to him, not because they respected his expertise, but because he controlled the purse strings. And this would erode his ability to control and manipulate the people who worked for him. Well, it was an extraordinary conversation.
I can imagine. We're talking with Janet Tavakoli, whose new book is Decisions, Life and Death on Wall Street. And Janet, what strikes me about that conversation that I think it's important for people to understand is that, for example, when I said, who wouldn't continue doing what they're doing if they're rewarded for it, I mean a certain type of person. And I think it's important because you illustrate that in your book with a lot of anecdotes that there are certain personality characteristics that lead you to succeed sometimes in these positions, particularly with the lack of oversight, regulation, good journalism, and so on that we tend to see surrounding them. But they're not good. They're not what normally would be considered good personality traits in the average person. And so you're describing Jamie Dimon in this case as someone who is, fearful, driven, obsessed with his own position. We see that in his public relations and so on. But you also describe in your book suicides and, stripper parties in the office or in the workspace and all sorts of things that, people might say, well, what's that got to do with finance? And my answer would be everything.
Mm-hmm. I agree with you. When I talk about strippers in passing, I mentioned Sheryl Sandberg's message to women to just lean in. And, I do that sort of jokingly, implying that she's somewhat naive. She may work in a career that's more like a ballet, but on Wall Street it's like an ice hockey game where you're getting slapped against the sideboards and you're getting hockey pucks slammed in your face. And it's a completely different dynamic, and people who aren't in the industry sometimes really can't appreciate what's going on. Money managers hiring prostitutes for pension fund managers is a way of buying the guys off. And there's no oversight of things like that. It's an environment that is extremely corrupting. And,
right.
There is no one telling anybody to put on the brakes. So if you're in that environment, you have to understand what you're walking into. Now, that said, I've been able to carve a niche for myself in this business, and you have to have a pretty tough hide to do that, especially if you're female and you see men who gain an advantage by basically buying sex workers for investors. Incredible
right.
that it still goes on today. And people hush it up and don't want to talk about it. In that kind of low moral environment is something that seeps into everything around it, and it's just a symptom of the bigger problem of fraud within the financial system. Fraud just starts to inform everything that it touches. When people feel they can break the rules and get away with it, they start breaking additional rules. And that's what happened in our global financial system, where people with a straight face lied to the press as if there's no consequence for doing it after Sarbanes-Oxley, which was meant to hold officers accountable so that you could prosecute them for lying to the press, and yet none of those prosecutions happened. As Bill Black likes to say, he was a regulator during the S&L crisis. They had over 1,000 felony indictments, and that was a much smaller crisis than our financial crisis, and there were fewer perpetrators, and yet we haven't had zero meaningful criminal indictments of key players in our global financial crisis.
So let me ask you a question, Janet, as we go forward on this issue. I'm just curious about this. You're an expert in this area. You've worked in this field. You know where the bodies are buried, perhaps literally, certainly figuratively, and sometimes I struggle with walking that line between moral outrage and not being that annoying person who's morally outraged all the time.
I hear what you're saying, and I think that there are a couple comments that I think are essential to make on that point. One is that you'll recall that Brooksley Born, when she brought up problems with derivatives, she was painted as someone, and this was Bob Rubin and Larry Summers and others, lied about her and tried to destroy her reputation with people who didn't know her, saying that she was irascible and unreasonable. And that wasn't true. Now you hear those same arguments being levied against Elizabeth Warren. In fact, you wrote an article about this, about Andrew Ross Sorkin using words like wrath, rage, making her sound unreasonable, and yet nothing that she had written rose to that level at all. And I have to say that perhaps there was a bit of misogyny involved in that, where they feel that they can, people will believe women are emotional, and yet, you could say, you could look at Jamie Dimon's behavior and use exactly the same adjectives about him, and you would be more accurate.
Hey, I worked for Hank Greenberg at AIG. You want to know about wrathful? Give Hank a call. That's my recommendation.
And yet they realize that somehow people would buy it when it's said about these women. And you rarely hear that same kind of thing said in a negative way about men. You know, have you read articles about Hank Greenberg calling him wrathful and enraged?
And emotional,
I haven't.
Yeah. Well, of course, and I think that's absolutely right. I think there's an element of misogyny, but yet, I suppose in the end you have to concentrate on being a truth teller and let the chips fall where they may, and all of this. And I think, Janet Tavakoli, you've certainly done that, and I really recommend that people take a look at this new book, Decisions, Life and Death on Wall Street. Before we go, I guess, just to wrap up, because I do want to encourage people to read the book, what do you think people will learn when they read it, especially people who aren't like you and me and embedded in the numbers and all that, and just want to know what's going on with the centers of financial power?
Well, I think they will get a very clear picture that there is something drastically wrong that needs to be changed. And, you know, my boss, Bill Brookschmidt, part of the reason I believe that he committed suicide is because he could not reconcile some of the things that had been done at Deutsche Bank and that he might be held accountable for, specifically using the bank's balance sheet to accommodate tax trades for hedge fund managers and putting the bank at risk after the financial crisis to earn a few coins. And the risk was outside of, out of proportion with the gains that they were making, in the opinion of our Senate. So I think that we haven't cleaned up the system, and the only way you're going to do that today is to enforce consequences on people and start prosecuting them and putting them in jail, because otherwise they are simply rewarded for ongoing fraud in our financial system.
Absolutely. I couldn't have put it better myself, and I would only add to that we need to reflect as a culture the fact that we recognize now, as we did in the 19th century and as we did in the 1930s, culturally, that this is also bad behavior and not something that should be lionized. And I know you agree with that as well. So
yes,
thanks so much.
I completely agree with it. Our media narrative is completely distorted.
Yeah, absolutely. So again, thanks for helping correct that distortion. Thanks for writing this great book, Decisions, Life and Death on Wall Street. And Janet Tavakoli, thanks so much for joining us.
Thank you, Richard.
We'll be right back after this. I'm Richard RJ Eskow, and this is The Zero